the slideshow. Okay, awesome. All right. So before I get started, I just want to offer, as I'm getting situated here, please forgive me, a quick acknowledgement of the land that I'm presenting this from today. That's very important to me. I've included a land acknowledgement that I've crafted based on the Native American Cultural Center here at Purdue University, and also included a brief statement from Northwestern University, which I found helpful in terms of just appreciating the significance of a land acknowledgement statement. I'm happy to send a link over to their page later if anyone is interested. So in acknowledgement of the traditional homelands of the Indigenous people, which Purdue University is built upon, we honor and appreciate the Potawatomi, the Delaware, the Miami, and the Shawnee people, who are the original Indigenous caretakers of this land. The title of my presentation is Wither Welsh in Independent Wales. And on my first screen, in the background, we have the seal of Owain Glyndwr. Owain Glyndwr was the last leader of an independent Wales from approximately 1400 to 1415. In this image, we see Owain Glyndwr on horseback, seemingly riding into battle with a shield in one hand and a sword in the other. So very briefly, I just want to situate Wales, or Cymru, on the map, since I think it often is a nation that gets lost between its larger neighbors. We see here Wales is situated between Ireland and England. It's relatively small, both in terms of population and geography, about the size of Belgium, a little bit smaller in terms of size, and about 3.15 million people call it home today, with 2 official languages as of 2011. Welsh, or Cymraeg, and English. And as we are talking about the push for Welsh independence, we're talking about Welsh nationalism. I want to make sure that we level set on what we're talking about and what we mean when we talk about Welsh nationalism. In this image, you see a man standing in front of a protest crowd carrying a bullhorn. In the background, we have a large banner that says Annibyniaeth, which means independence. And there are a large number of people in the crowd that have a variety of Welsh flags. So when we talk about Welsh nationalism, we're not talking about what we think of necessarily in a contemporary American context. So when we think about nationalism today in the United States, we think about white nationalism, we think about white supremacy, we think about an appeal to a mythic past of a white Christian heteronormative America that never actually existed. That is not the case when we're talking about Welsh nationalism. It's very much akin to Scottish nationalism, if that helps situate it for anyone. This is a predominantly left-wing movement that's inclusive toward Welsh speakers and non-Welsh speakers alike, toward people who've lived in Wales and called Wales home for generations, and new arrivals. So I just want to make sure that when we're talking about the movement for Welsh independence today, that there's no ambiguity there. There's no question about that. So very briefly, I'm going to do my best to make this as quick as possible. I just want to give a brief history of the Welsh language for the last 500 years. I'm sure I can do this in about 60 seconds. But I just want to share this because the Welsh language has been remarkably resilient over such a long period of time. Dating back 500 years, the Laws in Wales Acts said that only English could be used in legal procedures in Wales. So this effectively meant that people in Wales did not have access to fair treatment under the law. They were obligated to deal with the legal system in a language that the vast majority of people in Wales could not understand. We're talking about 99% of the people in Wales cannot understand English at this time. In the 1800s, we see an influx of English immigrants to Wales during the coal boom. The population soared as the coal industry in Wales was one of the largest and most profitable in the entire world. So we see this sort of beginning of chipping away at the Welsh language as more and more English-speaking immigrants are coming into the country and not necessarily learning the language. In 1847, there's a very important event that I'm including for its specificity, but also because I think it represents a lot of attitudes on the part of the English establishment toward the Welsh that even to this day still endures in some form. The Blue Books, as it's called, was a report filed by 3 Oxford scholars who did not speak Welsh at all. And instead of doing what they were supposed to do, which was write a report on the state of education in Wales, they instead used the opportunity to include in the report very denigrating language against the Welsh character in the report. And I'm citing Geraint Jenkins here, who talks about the report. The Welsh were liars and cheats. The women were primitive and unchaste. They clung to an absurd vernacular and an outmoded culture, which kept them under the hatches. And this attitude is really reflective of it. There's an ongoing attitude that is somewhat reflective of this statement, of this idea that the Welsh language is outmoded. It's a language of peasants. It's a language of the country. Excuse me. I'm trying to talk as fast as possible without stumbling over my words so that I can try to finish on time. So it's very reflective of an attitude that exists even to this day. What we see changing in the 20th century, Welsh is on the decline well into the 20th century. What we see in the middle of the 20th century is that a number of activists formed to start coalescing to try to change that. So in 1962, Cymdeithas yr Iaith Gymraeg was founded, the Welsh Language Society, which started engaging in civil disobedience to try to bring a spotlight to the fact that the Welsh language is not being treated equitably in the Welsh country. In 1967, as a result of some of these actions, we see the Welsh Language Act, which started to try to put Welsh back on some sort of equal footing, though it was nowhere near sufficient enough. It just was sort of an opening of the door and acknowledging that the Welsh language, in fact, existed and should be given some measure of respect. In 1993, we see that act strengthened in saying that Welsh could be used in legal proceedings. And finally, in 2011, Welsh became the co-official language of Wales, along with English. So at the same time that there's all this organizing going on around the Welsh language, there's also this other movement toward political autonomy and this push toward devolution and eventually independence. And what we're talking about in devolution, in the context of the United Kingdom, obviously London is the capital of the United Kingdom, but the people of Scotland, Northern Ireland, and Wales all have their own devolved systems of government, which permits some decision-making powers to the local authorities. So in 1979, this idea of devolution was put to the Welsh people and defeated soundly. 20 years later, it passes, but only just. Fast forward toward present day, and we have a growing conviction, a growing belief that Wales should be able to make more decisions for itself. We see consistently in polling that about 3/4 of the Welsh public supports the Senedd, which is the Welsh Parliament. And at the same time, we see, in fact, support growing for further powers to be devolved from London and support for independence reaching a record high of 40% in March of this year. So I'm going to skip forward 2 slides to take a look at the 1997 referendum results about devolution. On the left-hand side, we see the results from the 1997 referendum. In the regions shaded in green, these are regions that voted in favor of devolution. The areas in various shades of pink and red voted in opposition to devolution. Now, what I think is really interesting about this is putting this in conversation with the map on the right-hand side, which is also of Wales. This shows levels of Welsh proficiency in various regions across Wales, the darker blues being regions that are more proficient, and the light blue that's almost white being areas that are very Anglo-centric, where Welsh is not spoken. And what we see with this map is that a lot of the borderlands, a lot of the border territories with England, and a lot of the southern urban communities that received a large influx of immigrants previously in the 19th century and until today are not strongholds of the Welsh language, or at least were not strongholds of the Welsh language. And these are the areas that tended to vote in opposition to devolution. What's interesting is that today, now that Wales has gained more autonomy and more power over their education system, and the Welsh language has attained a greater level, a greater degree of respect, we see that there's an influx in young people learning Welsh. These numbers are pulled from 2021. They're very recent, I believe, from March of this year, pulled directly from the Welsh government's website. It shows that in the age 3 to 15 bracket, we have a tremendous influx of Welsh speakers. Whereas if we look at like the 25 to 34, 35 to 44, these generations prior, these older demographics, did not necessarily have access, in fact, did not have access to Welsh language medium schools, or else it was extremely limited. As it's broadened, we see an influx in Welsh speakers, and it leaves us to question what impact will that have on future generations in support for devolution, in support for independence, as Welsh becomes a language, in fact, of the cities and of the urban centers, not just the countryside. We have some hints at how this might bear out in terms of support for independence in young people. A St. David's Day poll from March 1st of this year showed that 16 to 24-year-olds are the most likely to support independence. And in this graph, we see that's only at 40%, so we're not talking about a clear majority at all. It's obviously not even a majority. But at the same time, the level in opposition is much smaller than in older generations as well. The general, the high watermark in terms of polling that came out in March of this year was overall 40% in favor, 50% opposed. Now in this graph, we see 40% in favor, but we see a much smaller number who are opposed to the idea of independence, which suggests that there's more openness to the idea. So as I'm moving to close, I want to talk about the idea of language and nationhood, and this is really where I want to dig in more in future research. As people are questioned about why they support independence, one of the highest reasons, one of the highest justifications given is that they feel Wales is a historically separate nation, with 51% of people who support independence giving that justification. So while language isn't specifically cited, I think that we can assert that nationhood is often defined in part by language. And in fact, there's a Welsh saying that reinforces this. Cenedl heb iaith, cenedl heb galon. And I'm sure my pronunciation is not great. I'm a novice Welsh learner myself. So that means essentially in English, a nation without a language is a nation without a heart. We see this carried out in the Welsh national anthem. For example, you can see the poster right over my shoulder. I just took a picture of it so you can see it a little bit closer. These are the lyrics to Henlad Fenedau, the Welsh national anthem, Land of My Fathers. And throughout the anthem, there are references to the language, including the closing line, Badad i'r heniaith barhau, which means may the old language endure. And we see in polling around Welsh speakers from 2019, a YouGov poll showed that Welsh speakers were about twice as likely to support independence as non-Welsh speakers. So in closing, I wanted to just quickly cite a friend of mine who talked about the importance of the Welsh language in his life and his support for independence. And I thought this was a really nice way to put the views of many people within the movement for independence. He said, for me personally, the Welsh language is a huge part of my identity. Having said that, my wife doesn't speak the language, but is as Welsh as I am. Not being a Welsh speaker doesn't necessarily have any bearing on Welshness, although I would argue that support and love for the language, whether you speak it or not, does. So thank you very much. Appreciate it. I'm very grateful to have had this opportunity.
Thank you, Joel, for your wonderful presentation. Next, let's welcome the second presenter, Carlos Cignaglia from Michigan State University. The title of the presentation is It Comes Down to Respect, One Student's Investment in Learning Spanish.
Thanks so much, Olivia. Give me 1 sec as I get configured here. Joel, thank you very much. That was a great presentation and a really nice backdrop and segue, I think, into some of the things that I'm going to talk about. So I really appreciate that. Let's see. I did this out of order. Okay. Can you just let me know if you can see these slides? Good, great, thank you. I have an updated title. Thank you, Olivia, for the introduction, because this is a work in progress that I've had a small update on. But yeah, so I guess the addition to the title would be, It Comes Down to Respect, Identity, Positioning, and Investment in Learning Spanish. It's the same project, don't worry. As Olivia mentioned, I am a PhD student in second language studies at Michigan State. I used to be in Philadelphia though, and GSALT, the second GSALT in 2016 was one of the first conferences that I ever went to as a grad student. And so it's a great venue. I really appreciate the organizers for putting together this year's event. And I hope you're all enjoying it so far. It's great to see some familiar faces and names here. I'm in cold Michigan and I miss Philadelphia, so I'm happy to be back in Philadelphia virtually for the day. Yeah. So Joel mentioned a really important idea in that last closing piece about support and love for a language. And I think that's a key idea that you can see from the title of my presentation that comes out. So yeah, I think that's really cool. So what I'm going to do in this presentation is say a bit about the genesis of it, how it came out from some coursework that I'm doing. I'll say a bit about the frameworks that have shaped my study. I'll talk about the methodology that I engaged in, and then where I'll try to spend some time is on the findings. I'll talk about kind of 2 areas of findings, and then I'll talk about how this might relate to the work that we do as teachers and researchers and learners. So I will say there is a handout associated with my presentation. I uploaded it as well as a PDF of these slides to the session page on the website. So if you visit that page, you should be able to download it. The handout I'm going to use, if we were in person, I would probably bring that and give it to everybody for the second part of the findings. So if you want to take a look, you can. You don't have to read through it. You can read through it. You can do whatever you'd like, as if we were in person, but it will come up later. Okay, I'm going to try not to talk too fast either, because the last time I gave this presentation, it was in a 20-minute window. So yeah, so I'm a foreign language learner and a foreign language instructor formerly. And with some of my colleagues, we were having a conversation this past year about foreign language study in US universities. And some of the research done by the Modern Language Association has kind of, as well as our own experiences, have kind of pointed out and reminded us that foreign language programs, as well as humanities programs in general, are really at risk and called into question recently in US universities. And a lot of foreign language programs lose funding or are kind of eliminated because of low enrollment among students. And so in light of a lot of this research that's really large scale, looking at quantitative trends, I wanted to kind of focus on what my skills are, qualitative research, and take a look into what the report's called for, an exploration of maybe student and teacher experiences with foreign language learning. So that's what this presentation is, a qualitative case study of one focal participant, one student's investment in foreign language learning. So the conceptual framework that I'm using for this study is investment. And if you're not familiar with investment, it's kind of like motivation. It developed in the 90s as a sociological complement to motivation, and kind of looks at how engagement and commitment to learning a second language is not necessarily just an internal trait, but how is it also shaped by social context. And so it kind of asks questions like, what role do teaching practices or beliefs among fellow students have in shaping an individual's commitment to learning a second language? And how might a second language or forms of second language knowledge be valued differently in different contexts? And so the investment model looks like this. It's comprised of 3 constructs: identity, capital, and ideology. Identity can be understood as how somebody understands their relationship to the world, how they talk about that, how they construct that through discourse. Capital can be understood as maybe resources somebody has, what they know, what they have monetarily, maybe who they know, social connections. And then ideologies can be understood as kind of a widespread dominant ways of thinking or assumptions that aren't really questioned, specifically about language use, speakers. And so these ideas interact with each other. Ideologies value and frame capital in different ways. And so if the capital you possess is valued or not valued, depending on the ideologies, then the ideologies position you as an individual in different ways, influencing part of your identity. It goes the other way around. As an individual, you can construct your identity by investing in forms of capital that are valued by dominant ideologies or not. And so you can position yourself in relation to ideologies by aligning with them or not aligning with them. So it's pretty complex, but it's a really interesting framework. And so, yeah. In addition to that, another lens that I'm using is narrative inquiry. And if you're not familiar with narrative inquiry, it's about stories, using stories as data and using stories as the lens through which to analyze data. And so you can analyze data in 2 ways, more than 2 ways, but 2 ways to analyze data is by looking at the content, asking what is a story about, but also by looking at the discourse features. How does the story take shape interactionally? And identity is something that we do by talking about it. We talk about our identity, but we also talk and construct our identity that way. So a specific type of discourse analysis that might look at identity is positioning analysis. Okay, so positioning analysis, one way to do positioning analysis is to analyze the positioning in a story by looking at positioning on 3 levels. So as an individual tells a story, how do they construct their position in relation to how they describe characters in the story? The second level, how do they construct their identity positions in relation to each other, who they're talking to? And the third level, how do they construct identity positions in relation to the ideologies at play in their story? And so just a few other studies about investment and positioning in these contexts that I think might be relevant. So Marshall and Bockhorst-Hung looked at investment among 8th grade learners of French in Canada and found that their investment was kind of skewed or balanced, focusing on different types of capital based on the types of interaction and participation they had in multilingual communities. And so that's kind of relevant to my study, as we'll see. And then Gary Barkhausen did a lot of studies focusing on language learners and language teachers, looking at how kind of what these two findings illustrate is identity is sort of related to awareness of the sociopolitics of language and how learning or teaching a certain language affects an individual, maybe their communities as well, but also how identity and positioning is something that's done discursively through the action of storytelling. So yeah, so with those things in mind, my research questions are looking at how my focal participant, Morgan, how her investment and identity are shaped by ideologies around multilingualism and language learning. So specifically by looking at capital and ideologies and identity, how are they at play? How is capital an affordance in her investment? What ideologies constrain or enable her investment? And how does she construct her identity through positioning herself? So the study was conducted at a liberal arts university in the Northeast United States. At this university, students are required to study 2 semesters of a foreign language. Outside of that, most students stop taking a foreign language. And so that's kind of my reason for investigating this. The focal participant is Morgan. She completed the 2-semester sequence of 2 courses. I was her instructor. That's got that's a big positionality issue. And so I'm happy to talk about that afterwards if you'd like. But it's interesting because she actually took a 3rd course after the requirement with a different instructor. And so that's part of the focus there. But what I really want to highlight here is Morgan's journey. What she reflects on in this study is her participation in an international conference about global leadership that actually took place in high school, and how that experience shaped her ideas about language learning throughout college, where she continued to take Spanish classes, and now her sort of outlook towards the future as she considers maybe studying abroad. Right. So the data for this study were collected through semi-structured and narrative interviews. The first interview we conducted focused on her past learning experience, her ideas about language learning and the requirement, and then a follow-up interview that was maybe more narrative in form that invited her to revisit these topics in greater detail through storytelling, reflective storytelling. And so these data were analyzed qualitatively for content and for discourse. So the themes that were salient from the investment model were kind of focal points for analysis, ideology, and capital. And then for identity, I wanted to take a discourse approach and look at how she constructed her identity in relation to the 3 different levels of her story, so using positioning analysis. And so the first 2 research questions relate to the content analysis, and 2 major themes were about capital and ideology. And so what I'll show you are a few interview excerpts that illustrate how she sees L2 learning as being valued differently in different contexts, and how she draws on discomfort as a form of capital that'll help her. And then her awareness of different ideologies in her university context and how she sort of aligns with them or not with them. So with this excerpt, she's talking about the conference that she went to and the international peers that she met. And her biggest eye-opening experience there was this realization that everybody speaks English. Everybody has to learn English. This is kind of her speaking about her interactions with her peers. And she's kind of comparing that to her experience. So asking, how do you guys know this? And realizing that her friends are explaining, we've had to learn English since the beginning of time. So that was kind of an eye-opening moment for her. So she sees that language learning is valued differently in different places, right? And so she's thinking about her own experience. I don't think we're encouraged to learn that. Why are these expectations here? Why are people expected different things about languages? So she's starting to kind of form her own ideas. And in this excerpt, we have the idea. It comes down to respect. And a second thing that she talks about was this idea of discomfort as something she can draw on as an affordance for her learning, something that is worth investing in because it will help her with the return of learning a language in this way by understanding somebody else's experience and coming back to this idea of respect, support, and appreciation, which we just heard about. And so then in terms of ideologies, she talks about kind of circulating dominant ways of thinking in her university context. So when she's talking about other students at the university, she considers how they might roll their eyes about having to take a language, maybe resenting the foreign language requirement, not seeing it as necessary, not thinking that they're gaining any benefit from it. And so she starts to kind of maybe take a different idea. And then she compares her experience in her earlier Spanish classes with her later Spanish class. And she's talking about how in one class, she was kind of encouraged to try communicating her ideas, which aligned with her idea about respect. But in this third class, being graded on the details of grammar. And so in the last line, she talks about how that kind of influences her idea. I'm really more interested in what she calls the cross-cultural communication side of things rather than being fluent in Spanish side of things. And so finally, when she reflects on, continuing to take Spanish classes, she says, I've gone far enough. There's only so much you can learn from a classroom. I want to see it. I want to experience it. I'm redirecting how I want to go about learning it. And so I think this is interesting because it shows us the ideologies at play that are kind of constraining her investment in classroom learning, but also how she's exercising agency and sort of redirecting, literally, as she says, how she wants to go about learning Spanish. So that's interesting. But what I want to highlight also is how her identity is kind of at play. And so to do that, I looked at positioning. Let's see. Yes, so with positioning, I'm looking at stories on 3 levels. And so this graphic, I want to illustrate stories on 3 levels. Big stories, small stories, and short stories. And it's not that confusing, don't worry. We can think of the big story as Morgan's entire life experience. We can think of the small story as how she tells a story during conversation. And we can think of the short story as what I just showed you, extracts of interview put together in story form. And so for the content analysis, I looked at Morgan's short story. For the positioning analysis, I'm looking at Morgan's small story. So from the second narrative interview, I'm looking at a conversation during that interview where she tells a story. And my reason for this is small story analysis at that level looks at a story that's told in conversation with a focus on the performance aspect of storytelling. And so, whereas the short story that we just looked at was all of these different snapshots that talk about how Morgan's experience with the high school conference, her ideas on campus about learning Spanish, and then her future plans. The small story tells the same story, but it's kind of all together. And so in one telling. And so this is the handout that I'll make some reference to. And I'm not going to go through all of the excerpts that I have here. So don't worry if it feels like I'm going fast, but you have this handout and we can talk about this later. I just want to be mindful of time here. So the findings from the positioning analysis so far are on 3 different levels illustrated by 3 different colors here. In terms of the first level, Morgan contrasts her experience with her international peers. And my interpretation, I'm arguing that she constructs an identity as like a privileged American student in relation to international peers. In terms of level 2 positioning, she's interacting with me as she's telling this story, right? But she's also interacting with sort of an audience of her story. And she makes use of 3 discourse features, giving advice, meta commentary, and then articulating her opinion or taking a stance. And I'm interpreting this as her constructing identity positions of an intercultural citizen or an intercultural language learner and an advocate for multilingualism. And in terms of level 3 positioning, the ideologies at play in her story are these ideas about English dominance, about multilingualism being optional in the United States, and about the foreign language requirement being just that, a requirement. And as well, this idea about intercultural citizenship and intercultural language learning. So very briefly, I guess I'll show you an example of one of each of these different levels so you can see. And so level 1 positioning, this is an example where Morgan, again, is comparing her experience with the experiences of her international peers from the conference. And so she's talking about their experience. Everyone spoke English. It wasn't their first language, but everyone spoke English. And she thinks about her experience growing up in the United States. Spanish classes, they just teach you another language, and you just assume that everyone else learns those languages. Well, it's not the case. Almost everyone is taught English as a necessity. You need to know English. So what I'm highlighting here is how she contrasts these different perspectives. She uses the phrase eye-opening. You can hear an exclamation in how she talks about the story. And so in highlighting her limited experience here and her shock about these assumptions, she's kind of, again, constructing that idea of a privileged American student. And so she does that a few more times. And yeah, on level 2 positioning, let's see here. Yes. She gives advice. I'm going to preview this. She gives advice about how to maybe be an intercultural citizen, and then she takes that advice for herself. And so she takes it on herself there. So not only giving that advice to other people, but giving that advice to herself. And then she uses meta commentary. I'll skim through here to kind of qualify what she's saying and avoid overgeneralizing in different points of her story. And I'm interpreting that as this, critical awareness that's part of intercultural language learning. And then in articulating her opinion and her stance, she positions herself as an advocate for multilingualism by kind of calling out linguistic inequality. And so level 3 positioning kind of aligns with everything else before, and I'm really not going to go into it much there, but it's in the slides. And so I'll close just by recapping briefly here. The 3 investment components are at play in Morgan's experience in these ways. What I think is kind of the main connection to what I've been looking at before is not just how she constructs her identity as somebody who might be invested in learning Spanish, but how this idea of critical awareness at the bottom here is a possibility for US college students who are learning a foreign language. And so a big connection that I think this might have to foreign language teaching and foreign language learning is what role might critical reflection on the sociopolitics of language, how might that be present in the basic language courses? These courses do exist in language programs, but they're usually reserved for language majors, language minors in their 3rd or 4th year of university study. What would it be like to include this in Spanish 102 alongside verb conjugations? So that might be next steps to think about something like that. So I've included some references to some of the topics I talked about, and it's definitely a work in progress. So I'll welcome any suggestions or questions or comments you have later on or through email. Thanks for being patient with me with time here. I appreciate you tuning in. And I look forward to discussing more with you.
Okay, thank you, Carlo, for your wonderful presentation. So our last presenter is Sarah Carajoca from Rutgers University. The title of the presentation is Language Ideologies and Conversationalization in Majority Latinx High Schools Mathematics Classes. Sarah could not be here today, so we're going to play a video of her presentation.
Excuse me, were you able to hear it?
No.
Let me start over. I'm so sorry. I muted myself, so.
Hello, my name is Sarah Carajoca. I'm from Rutgers University, and this is my presentation, Language Ideologies and Conversationalization in Majority Latinx High School Mathematics Class. I'm sorry I couldn't be with you live for the presentation, but due to a death in the family, we've had a lot to contend with. So I hope everyone's having a good time, and I'm sorry I can't be with you. So the first thing is that I want to present a mathematics as universal ideology. So in order to do my investigation, I was looking at the 3rd standard of mathematical practice located inside the Common Core, construct viable arguments and critique the reasoning of others. This mathematical practice standard can be summarized as the word argumentation. But because we even have standards, it lends itself to this universal ideology that there's this one right way and one best way. And the document, the Common Core Math Standards, have words like expertise and longstanding importance and communicate precisely. So there are these expectations around language and the legacy of language that contributes to this mathematics as universal ideology. Here's Mira and Ahmad's myths about standardized language. So these are the 4 myths that they identify. And in order to look at mathematics as sort of a standardized language in and of itself, I kind of mapped concepts and things that were told to me in my experience as an educator and as a researcher onto their myths. So the first one is that numbers are universal, and that's often used as a way to de-focus the trouble that English learners have on mathematics. So they'll say that numbers are universal, they should understand 1 is 1, and so that kind of aligns with there's only one standard variety. Two, it is inherently superior. So we'll get this, there's always one right answer, and people are kind of like, are very, very proud and affectionate toward mathematics that there's one right answer. Experts are anyway. And there's talk of mathematical elegance and simplicity. And so it's the language around mathematics that it's superior. It has no accent. This I'm going to kind of extend it beyond like your heard, listened to accent to this belief that mathematics is culture blind. So we don't talk about where it came from. It kind of exists in a vacuum. We don't attribute it to people necessarily unless they're generally white people. That kind of thing. So this culture blind presentation, if you open up textbooks, you're not finding information about cultures or anything in another language, or that stuff is very, very sparse. And then four, it's fixed and doesn't change. So we have this permanence, and when people want to say things about mathematics that suggest its permanence, they'll say, well, 2 + 2 is 4, or 1 + 1 is 2. And this is used when you're discussing things to basically like solidify this fixed item that can be attained. And that's that mathematics universal ideology. We have this universal thing. It's always this. It'll never be not 4. 2 + 2 will never not be 4. So we can rest assured that there's a right way and a wrong way. There's a standard. So the argumentation that I'm looking at, we have a quote from Van Emeren over here. It's a verbal and social activity of reason aimed at increasing or decreasing the acceptability of a controversial standpoint for the listener or reader by putting forward a constellation of propositions intended to justify or refute the standpoint before a rational judge. So it's basically putting an argument out there, a claim, supporting that claim, and with the intent to defend it or refute it. There's this give and take of ideas, and it makes it ripe for discourse analysis because it's a social activity that's supposed to be taking place in math class according to these Common Core standards. So the reasons argumentation are kind of important, especially for Latinx learners or students of color. First of all, to be functional in a technologically rich society like we are now, that is trying to be democratic, you need to be able to take information and sort through that information on your own, because people have access to way more information than they had access to before. And it's not mediated through your education or through access to a library or through that kind of thing. So you're getting information from all different sources, all different sites. And as we've seen in basically our American politics, there's a very, very significant issue with weeding through what's accurate, what's inaccurate, what makes sense, what doesn't make sense. And argumentation is basically seen as a way to do that. Scientific claims are advanced through argumentation. So people will make a claim, they'll support it with evidence, people will refute it with counterexamples or other theories, and it's basically a way to arrive at some kind of progress when there's really a lot of unknowns. Individual cognition rooted in social interaction. So we know that learning is improved in a social sphere. Argumentation's domain specific. So I was thinking of, I just watched Legally Blonde, the movie. And if you realize there's the segment where Elle, the main character, she is seen as not capable because of her language use, and she's trying to get into this law setting. So if law is the domain, she's trying to study to become a lawyer. If she's not using jurisprudence and words that are from these textbooks, she is shamed and ostracized. So there's this domain specificity to being able to argue. Just because you can make a point, you have to make it the quote unquote right way. And lastly, argumentation can be taught. So it's highly controllable and changeable. It's not a circumstance that is static. So we also have this ideology that mathematics is universal. There's the mathematical register. It's considered a thing. And this quote about it, you can basically see all the issues. First of all, we're looking for discrepancies between out-of-school speech and in-school speech that is sanctioned. So these two words like discrepancies is deficit viewpoint. Being sanctioned invokes power relationships that are present in the school setting. So basically, they can say those things, but they're not allowed. There's a power dynamic there. And they know that the discrepancies, quote unquote, are causes of academic failure. They know that they're not allowing students to progress because of this language. And we know it's a problem for marginalized students and students of color. So my research site was a project-based research site. They are supposed to ground everything in project learning. It's an inner city urban high school that sends students there to this alternative research site, and it was like an algebra 2 class. So my data collection was supposed to be done in 3 stages, and it consisted of classroom observations and then student interviews and teacher interviews, all being triangulated after I heard the student interviews and teacher interviews with final observations and artifacts. Unfortunately, due to COVID-19, in the beginning of March, I was no longer able to go. And so I missed all of those stages. So much of my data is coming from observations and field notes where I recorded verbatim. And there was one 15-minute interview that I used to ground all the data from one student's point of view. The findings were that under this math as universal language ideology, what I have is we have a whitelisting subject who's the teacher, who in any pink outline in the subsequent slides permits students to speak almost any way they want. However, she retains control and tries to correct students when they're dealing with the mathematics in the classroom. And she always has this like back to mathematics pull. So like whatever they're talking about, she's trying to pull them back. The only caveat to that is when they're speaking math in Spanish, and some students did that, including my interview participant. She has this like hands-off approach where she doesn't do anything. So here's an example. You can see the pink, those are all examples of non-standard English that are ignored. If we're talking about, so like the use of miss, whitelisting subjects have told me that it is disrespectful. Some don't care, but there is an issue with power with miss. If a student of color calls you that, then they don't know your name, and how could they not know who you are? And they call everybody miss. So those kind of things. And my favorite is the bottom, cross multiply, be like this, right, miss? So we have a student, she is using this non-standard English around mathematics. The teacher watches her and says like, yes, that's how you do it. And she's doing this problem on the board. But then the teacher gets up and literally and figuratively erases what she does and does it herself the proper way because she can't let it alone. In this next example, there's spontaneous singing and a lot of non-standard English going on that's not quote unquote appropriate for the classroom. And then the teacher's trying to elicit this answer from the students observing, and she says in the green, what do you want to talk about? So they've been working on a problem, and the student answers and says, I noticed they're all one off from one another. And then the teacher says, okay, good. Do you remember what word it? And the student's like contingent. And she's like, well, it starts with a C. So the students all trying guessing words that start with C. And then she says, the alphabet does this too, A, B, C, D. And they try and guess and they can't get it. And she says consecutive and writes it on the board. And the student says, man, I hate that. It's like when people ask you what your favorite movie is and you forget every movie you ever saw. So we have this, the mathematics was correct. They're all one off from one another. So the answers were one unit off from one another, but the teacher could not let that go. She wanted them to know the word. She diverges off this path. It's important enough to write on the board, but the correct mathematics was there. So we've got this ideology that all that's important is this mathematical language. What you said wasn't valid, and the student even has to kind of comment on the kind of trickery that is, when you're answering one question and somebody asks you something that you're not prepared to answer and you can't get it right, but you know the answer. And this is, so we've got even like vulgarity and non-formal address is all ignored. And we've just got the teacher saying, so the people that have done it have said it's not the same. Has anyone found an instance where it is the same? And we can see here that she's conscious of the fact that there is non-mathematical activity, but she is choosing to ignore it. In this last example, we've got two EL students. They reason together, predominantly in Spanish, and here they're going over to how to calculate 8 to the 1/3. And so the teacher calls on the student and says, Sam, what'd you get? And Sam says, hello, miss, how are you? And she seems lost and she wasn't prepared. I don't know why she didn't have the answer, why she responded that way. But the teacher laughs and says, I'm good, how are you? And Sam says, bien. And but the teacher immediately pivots back to the mathematics and says, so when you get 8 to the 1/3, what did you get? Sam picks up the calculator, says no say, which is I don't know. The teacher accepts the answer from another student, and Sam's no longer on the hook to answer. She asks if she can manipulate 2 somehow to get 8. Eric finally says cubed, and and someone says thank you, Eric, and Eric says de nada. So we have this like Spanish flowing in and out of this conversation, and it's accepted. Like no, she never says like speak in English or the target language is English, which I've heard in classrooms before. But she's not really acknowledging it. She's not engaging with it. It's just always this like back to math focus. Thing is sort of that there was this reverse conversationalization going on in the classroom. If we look at conversationalization as the routinized simulation of conversational spontaneity and observe that it's been found to deal with a power dynamic that the person with power is invoking this conversational approach to obscure or blur the lines between what's actually a request and what is being demanded, sort of to invoke complicity from the person who doesn't have power, then we can see that what happened in this classroom was that students who actually typically do not have the power and generally don't have power in a classroom were using conversation and conversationalization to pull power away from the teacher and exert control over their environment. So in this very small example, the teacher is trying to get them to read a probability problem. She says 10% of the chocolates have cherries. A student says disgusting, referring to the cherries. The teacher says, I hate cherries. And then this whole conversation ensues about cherries, forcing the teacher to go back and restart. According to the package, 10% of the chocolates would have cherries. So now we're back to square one, but she's trying to pull it back to the mathematics. The students constantly, in every single example that I have in this presentation, are pulling that power back away through this conversational technique. And I've termed that a reverse conversationalization because it's the opposite of how the power dynamics usually play out. I hope you enjoyed my presentation, and if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me. And I hope I could have joined you today, and if I can get there, I will, but have a wonderful rest of your conference. Hello, my name is Kara Hope.
Okay, so Joel, Carlo, and Sarah, thank you again for your presentations and sharing your research today. We have about 5 minutes for Q&A. So I'm going to open the floor to the audience. Let's start from there. Does anyone have any questions for our panelists? Lin?
Hi, first off, thank you both very much for your wonderful live presentations. I feel like I really learned a lot, especially like personally, I'm more of a quantitative person, so it's really eye-opening for me. But I do have a specific question for Carlo, because I think I relate that as well, because I'm not learning Spanish here, but learning English is really struggling for me. So I'm actually wondering if you had a chance, for example, to expand the scope of your study, would you expect anything similar across different students from multiple cultural backgrounds, or would you say that there may be a lot of like variance?
Thanks for the question, Lily. Yeah, I don't know. And that's something that's on my mind because, this is something that I want to expand on because this is, a pilot study. My immediate background is working with students who are learning Spanish in the United States, most of whom, or all of whom that I've worked with primarily, growing up as like white monolingual students in the United States. And so, I don't know, I think there are opportunities to ask similar questions and engage in similar conversations with students from different backgrounds who are learning different languages. But I think, yeah, and would it look differently? Probably, but would it look differently even with students also who have similar backgrounds to Morgan, who are learning Spanish in a similar context, it might also look different too. I think given my interests, that might be a context that I want to kind of stick with, because I think, looking at the sociopolitics of language, that's the subtitle to Jennifer Leman and Janet Fuller's book, Spanish and Speaking Spanish in the US. So, I mean, that's the context that's probably most interesting to me in terms of asking these questions. But I mean, it would be interesting to look at how students who grew up in the US learning different languages, what their investment looks like and in what ways. So yeah, I don't know, if I have a chance, maybe I'll do that. Yeah, so I guess that answers part of your question.
Yeah, completely makes sense. Thank you.
Does anyone else have any questions?
It's more of like a comment question for Joel. So I found your presentation particularly interesting because I lived in Mallorca, Spain for a long time, which is, there's a lot of Catalan there. And so I'm very, very, very familiar with the Catalan movement, which is very similar to the Welsh movement. I just actually didn't know it existed until you gave your presentation. And I thought you made a really good point about how typically the people who support the independence movement are also people trying to maintain the language. And it was funny because I was there in, from 2016 to 2014 to 2018. And it was still, you were watching all these laws go through and all these initiatives to try and keep the language. So I guess my question is like, what of that are we seeing right now? And what is really happening in the schools, if you know?
That's a good question. And just want to make sure, can you hear me all right? I just threw on headphones, so I want to make sure. All right, cool. I just never know quite how things are going to work when we're dealing with different technologies. That's a good question. And unfortunately, I don't think I have a good answer. We've seen that people have been pushing education reform over the past several generations. One of the points that Reinath made, the man that I quoted at the end, was that a lot of people who are in some of the older age demographics express regret of never having been never having had the chance to learn Welsh, not having had that readily available. So I think for a lot of organizers, it is really exciting for them to see that younger generations are having those opportunities. I am hoping to spend some time in Wales in the 2022-2023 academic year. Fingers crossed. I hope I'll get to go. I'll be quite devastated if I don't, but I'm hoping that that will be an opportunity to really understand things more on the ground in terms of what the education system looks like, how that's set up in Welsh, and what kind of impact that's making in terms of reviving the language, pushing the language forward. I hope that at least to some extent answers your question. It's a good question.
It does, thank you.
Mhm.
Just in my observations, there are a lot of tough decisions that have to be made. A lot of, if you want to maintain a language, there's a lot of enforcing that you have to do very actively. So I think you'll find some really interesting things.
I think so too, and it's very interesting. I think we have these sort of very related but not totally overlapping movements right now towards political autonomy and revival of the Welsh language. So it's really interesting. It will be really interesting to do more research and to trying to understand to what extent the two are playing off of one another. I mean, for example, we see that on Duolingo, for example, Welsh is one of the fastest growing languages that people are learning within the United Kingdom. So it's like, to what extent do these successes play off one another, whether it's the success of the language, the success of the nation politically. We see during COVID-19, Scotland and Wales, perhaps Northern Ireland as well, I'm not sure, have taken drastically different approaches from England. And for a lot of people, seeing the success or the relative success of the measures taken by these nations independently of London has led a lot of people, for example, to think maybe we should have more powers, maybe we should be independent, for example.
Okay. It's time for us to close the session. Thank you everyone for attending. Again, you can ask and answer any questions about this session on our Whova webpage. And I just have some friendly reminders before we go. Our second keynote is going to start at 1:45. And the abstracts and breakout room numbers for poster presentations are available when you click exhibitor on the left side of our Whova page. And finally, we have our virtual happy hour taking place at 6:15. And you can access the link either from the agenda or by clicking community on the left side and locating the event. So thank you, everyone, and we hope to see you at our next sessions. Bye-bye.
Thanks so much, everybody. Take care.
That was great. You're awesome.
I was nervous, but thank you. Thank you so much for your help with the video and yeah, recording everything. So.
Oh yeah, I probably should stop. Okay, I'm gonna go to the other session.